Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, making a knife sharpening jig for my belt grinder. Today, I'll make a sharpening jig for my belt grinder. As a guy who makes semi-production knives, sharpening is a big issue for me. When you charge a fair amount of money for a knife, customers rightly expect to receive a very sharp knife. But sharpening by hand takes a lot of time. Sharpening is a fairly straightforward process once you do it for a while, but it still takes a lot of fiddling around to do it right each and every time. So, the idea here is to make a gizmo that will reduce the amount of time spent, wasted frankly, on this essential but boring and time-consuming task. So, here's the basic idea. The red parts shown here represent the platen on my Bader belt grinder. And this over here is a shoe that I added for mounting attachment arms for a grinding table and things like that. Now, the gray parts are the thing that I'm going to be making today. That's the sharpening jig. This arm here can slide in and out, allowing me to adjust the sharpening angle. And then this clamp right here holds the knife. It's got a little arm on it that pivots down here, allowing you to articulate the knife against the grinding belt, move it back and forth, cut that angle the same every single time. I'll start by making the mounting arm. It's going to be welded together from mild steel. 1 1/4 square bar here and 1 1/4 by 1/2 inch here. As with most of my tools, this is totally overbuilt. You could use much lighter stock. You could probably use square tube, whatever. And of course, it's going to depend, if you want to make one like it, on the grinder that you use. I'll begin by chopping the steel up. Then we'll weld the arm together. Of course, if you want to make one yourself and don't have welding equipment, you could drill and tap the pieces and it would work fine. I can't help but mention here that a lot of projects that I do require only minimal tools. Not today. There's all kinds of fancy tooling coming into play. Now you can do everything here in a less tool intensive sort of way, and I'll mention some ways of getting around the complex tools that I'm using, but I'm not gonna lie, it'll take you a lot longer. Even with the tools that I have, this took probably about 2 days to do. Before I weld on the pivot arm, I'll mill out the pivot hole. By the way, if you want detailed plans showing exactly how I made this with all the dimensions, I post plans for all my builds, including this one, on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Walter Sorrells, sign up to help out the channel, and you'll find plans for tons of knives and other cool knife making jigs, fixtures, tools, and so on like I'm making here today. I'm going to use a delrin bearing ball that I bought off eBay as the pivot for my clamp arm. Now, the next step will be me doing a ridiculously complicated thing just because I can. If you want to simply drill a hole and file in a chamfer on the top of this little pivot socket, it'll work totally fine. But what I'm doing is CNC milling a rounded socket that precisely matches the 1-inch pivot ball. Again, totally silly. I just did it because it was a fun challenge. I start by drilling a hole, then roughly milling the pocket with a 1/4 inch 4-flute mill. Everything's super mellow feeds and speeds so that I have time to catch any dumb mistakes that I make. After that's done, I switch to a 3/8 ball end mill and finish the socket. Next, I flip it and chamfer the bottom of that same socket hole. Next, I'll finish the welding. So now the arm's complete, it's time to make the clamps. The clamp and clamp arm are all made from aluminum. The bottom clamp part will be made from a scrap piece of 1-inch thick 6061 T6 aluminum, while the top clamp part will be 1/4-inch aluminum bar and the rod is 1/2-inch diameter. Now again, this is a very complicated part by home shop standards. Can you make it with a bandsaw, file, and a drill press? Absolutely, but it will take a while. So I'm just milling the thing on my Tormach CNC mill. Clamp it up, then mill out the excess with a 3/8 2-flute end mill. A number 7 drill to pilot for a 1/4-20 thread for a set screw on the handle socket and for a tightening screw for the clamp. Next, the second piece. All I'm doing here is milling the basic outline, then drilling the number 7 hole for an adjustment screw. I'd need thicker stock to mill the full depth outline on the CNC machine because then I'd have to turn it over, deck it off, blah blah blah. Just not worth the hassle. Instead, straight over to the grinder to remove the excess and get it to its final shape. Now I'm going to put this bevel on the back side of the clamps. By relieving them this way, it gives you enough clearance so that you don't bottom out the clamp when you're grinding. This is really important, and I may have to adjust these later on, but this is where they landed right now. Finally, I'll tap the holes with a hand drill. Again, easier, for me anyway, than doing it on the Tormach. Once that's done, I'll drill the handle socket on my manual mill. Again, my approach here is just done for speed, not because it's the sanest way to do it. Setting this up on the CNC would actually take longer than doing it by hand. Cheating here, just using an end mill to plunge out a 1/2-inch hole. And there we are, matching jaw parts. Last step, the clamp rod. After cutting it to length, I'll mill a little flat for the set screw. Then I'll mill out a 1/2-inch hole in the delrin ball. As it turned out, I should have plunged a lot faster and maybe run things slower. As it happened, I actually melted the plastic. No harm, no foul, lesson learned. Everything worked out okay, and I had some spare balls if I'd screwed it up. Anyway, a second number 7 hole goes here for a set screw. Next, we assemble the arm. It's worth mentioning that there are a ton of different ways of making clamps for a sharpening gizmo like this, all of them with their own little weird and significant limitations. The limitation of this particular design is that depending on the thickness of the blade you're sharpening, it may mount slightly off center, making the blade angle marginally different from side to side of the blade. In this case, I was designing it for the thickness range that the bulk of my knives are made, so it works fine for me. But another design might be better for you. There are ways of designing this that'll be sort of self-centering, but they're much more complicated to make. You'll notice there's an adjustment screw here that allows me to change the jaw angle so that I can keep the jaws flat on the blade no matter the thickness or the taper of the blade. And here we go. Here's one of my Tactics Armory shadows straight out of heat treat. Now obviously in real life I'd finish the knife before sharpening, but this will give you the basic idea. Just pop it in there, hit it on the grinder, nice clean angle. If you're curious to know how I typically do this, I start out with 120 ceramic to set the bevel angle, and then I switch to a high grit structured abrasive like this 45 micron belt from Combat Abrasives. Sometimes I might go through a couple of structured abrasive belts depending on how crazy I'm feeling. Then I'll finish up on a honing and polishing wheel to get it really shaven sharp. If I don't like the angle, I just adjust it by pulling the arm out. Eventually, I'll put some hash marks on the arm to indicate the angles so that I can repeat certain angles time after time. I'm sure over time I'll make some refinements as I dial in what works best with this tool, but for now, works like a charm. Alright guys, thanks for watching and we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.